Hi there, good evening, welcome. Spring has certainly sprung. I hope all of you joining us tonight were able to spend some time outside over the last few days. As we start to see some warmer weather creeping in, I think this has been quite a year for so many of the families that we have served. If you have joined us in the past, welcome back. Tonight, as all of our grief seminars have gone, I know that you'll be able to leave here feeling hopeful and leave here hopefully feeling supported. If you are new to our bereavement seminars, welcome. These seminars have been going on for the past few years. We would love to be able to do them live in person, but during this pandemic, we have all pivoted and we are happy to be joining you virtually this evening. My name is Jennifer Wells and I'm one of the managers here at Families First, and it has certainly been my honor to work with our speaker, Christine McMillan. Christine is a social worker in our community who has worked here with the families that we've served for over 20 years. She is a wonderful resource to our community who, even with just spending a few moments with her, I instantly feel comforted, and I know that she will be able to provide that comfort to you this evening. So please, thank you so much for joining us. Sit back and have a great night. And if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us at Families First, and we can always get you in touch with Christine McMillan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm definitely grateful to be back here again tonight. Special thank you to you and your team here at Families First for continuing to serve the bereaved in our community at a very sensitive and sad time in their lives. Certainly appreciate the funeral home continuing to bring this wonderful program. I'd also like to thank you out there who are watching, you the bereaved who are joining us today remotely. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm aware that this is not an easy process, but by you being here tonight, you're telling me you're willing to learn more about the grief process as well as to engage in it. So I hope you leave tonight with some solace and some information that's going to be valuable to you. So tonight we're going to talk about a term called closure that's very much used in relation to grief. And what exactly does that mean? What does closure mean? A lot of my clients, after they've been catapulted into this grief process, will ask me, when does it get better? When will I feel normal again? When will I feel like myself? When will I be able to breathe again? And while you might even want to move towards closure, you might at the same time be very insulted by it. You might not like the term. It doesn't sit well with you. So we're gonna talk about what does closure mean in the grief process. You will get an opportunity to ask questions. Actually, you'll have the opportunity through the whole evening to ask questions. Please do so in the chat portion, and we will address the questions, if there are any, at the end of the evening. So before we talk about grief specifically and closure, let's talk about what's the dictionary definition of grief. What does it mean? Just having some technical problems here. I wonder, Brianna, if you could help us out. There we go. I apologize for that. So what is dictionary definition of grief? Well, first of all, it could be the act of closing, the closure of a plant, a school, a place of worship. Or it could be something where you open and close, like a cap or a seal. Or alternatively, it could be the end or conclusion of a sporting event, a TV show. So those are the dictionary definitions, and that's to kind of give us a foundation. Keep that in mind as we progress through this evening and talk about how does that align with the grief process. With grief, you have to understand that it's actually what we call a social construct, which means it is something that's being created by one's culture or society to explain something, to describe an idea. And perhaps this has happened because we're not comfortable with painful experiences. Our attitude towards grief is really one of impatience. We are very uncomfortable with the process. And you'll have to admit, grief is really inefficient. It's not productive. We're not our normal self. And so our culture hurries you to move through it as quickly as possible. And you may feel pressured also to move towards some sort of ending. And we're all familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, starting at acceptance starting at shock and denial and ending with acceptance. And that appeals to us in the grief process because as human beings, we like order, we like predictability. And the grief process certainly is not predictable at all. So when we experience any type of uncomfortable or painful situation, not necessarily grief, maybe the end of a relationship, the end of a job, what does closure mean? It's been described as justice, healing, peace, acceptance, forgiveness, maybe forgetting, maybe revenge in some cases, maybe getting answers, getting to the bottom of it. We're looking for a nice, tidy ending to something or an experience that's very uncomfortable. But at grief, when we're talking about grief, what exactly is the end point? What are we seeking closure to? What are we looking for? What's our expectations? Are we looking for closure to the pain, to the sadness? And some people expect closure after the funeral ritual, a memorial service, perhaps after the first death anniversary, or after your loved one's belongings have been dispersed. We're seeking a relief of some kind. Sadness and grief deplete us of our inner resources. Physically, we are exhausted. Mentally, we are distracted. And emotionally, we live on the edge, fearing a loss of composure when we are with friends and family. Well, it's no wonder that we want this state of being to end. It's no wonder that we want to find some type of relief. But the grief experience is so much more complex. So I ask you, should we even be locking up our painful emotions? Should we even be rushing through it? Can we do it? Because when we do that, we are tempted to engage in what we call mourning avoiding behaviors. And we'll talk about that, because what happens with mourning avoiding behaviors, it actually prolongs the grief process. One of the things I'd like you to leave with tonight is that what you are feeling especially if the death of a loved one was not very long ago, is that what you were going through, the grief process, is a natural outcome. I would be more concerned if I didn't see any grief symptoms. So what is this phenomena that we're talking about? So I'm going to go through some of the symptoms, some of the signs and symptoms of grief, and specifically grief after the death of a loved one. Now, just like a list of adverse side effects of medication, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to experience all of these. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to. But the reason for me sharing this with you tonight is that you understand, if you have experienced it to some degree, that it's normal and that there's nothing wrong with you. So when we think about the grief process, obviously, we think in terms of the emotional realm. We think about sadness, yearning. So after shock and numbness, you can pretty well experience just about any emotion and any feeling. So once again, please don't prescribe anything for yourself. So you can experience guilt, maybe even some form of relief. You can experience jealousy or resentment. And those things aren't normally associated with the grief process, but they're also very real emotions and feelings that come to the surface. Certainly a sense of vulnerability. You could feel anxious, fearful, powerlessness. And as I said, maybe a sense of relief or release if your loved one died after a lengthy illness. So while these emotions and feelings are very common, once again, you don't have to experience all of them. Now, the other way grief can also affect us is actually on a physical realm, because our body has cells that has memories and also absorb the experience, the painful experience. And grief is a stress reaction to being separated from your loved one. And so when we experience different types of stress, we hold it in our bodies. Now, a lot of people don't know that grief affects us physically. So they may question eating and sleeping disturbances, headaches. They may question loss of appetite. They may question heart palpitations, shortness of breath. But that's your body and your mind trying to adjust to this new reality that you're experiencing. You may also experience what we call cognitive impairments. When we're emotional more than we usually are, it literally limits our ability to think. Neurobiologically, we know this from scans. So when you are acutely grieving, you will probably have difficulty with concentration, with memory. You might experience lack of motivation. You might be disorganized and confused. You might not be able to think logically. I once had a client who said, if I could make my pants match my top, it was a good day, especially early in grief. Difficulty with decision making. I'm sure you must have heard that it's not advisable to make major decisions soon after the death of a loved one, because we are emotionally dysregulated and we're not thinking logically because we don't have the capacity to do so at that time. Grief also affects us socially. Now, the world might look normal, but we don't feel normal in this world. There might be a kind of a disconnect to things that are actually quite familiar to us. We may feel misunderstood. We may be highly sensitive. We may have a need to be close to people, and alternatively, we may want to retrieve and retreat into ourselves. We may withdraw from others. We may isolate. We may not be up to social occasions, especially early in the grief process. Once again, it's all very normal. Grief also affects you spiritually. And we don't mean religious. You don't necessarily have to have a faith-based approach. We're talking more in terms of the philosophical questions that we might ask ourselves when we're challenged. You might question, if you are a believer, is there a higher power? Where is your higher power? You might wonder why this has happened to you and your family. You might question your identity, perhaps your purpose. Is there any meaning left in life? Can I even go on? Do I want to go on? I have no meaning without this person in my life. These again are all very normal and natural responses to the grief process. So the challenge then for you as the bereaved is to understand what is considered normal. So first of all, there's no stages. Grief is very fluid. It can affect you on all 5 realms, but it is quite normal. So why wouldn't you want to be rid of? Why wouldn't you want to find closure to these sleepless nights, muscle tension, cognitive impairments, lack of motivation, feeling disconnected? But if grief is a normal and natural process after the death of a loved one, there is a way that nature provides us to move through the process. And that's through the process of mourning. So grief is what I feel and how I behave. It happens to me normally and naturally after the death of a loved one. But mourning is an intentional act that you do to help you manage the grief so that it changes and it softens. So mourning is actually any grief feeling or thought that you choose to express yourself outside of yourself. Sometimes it's culturally determined by society, and we definitely are in a mourning avoiding society, which actually is not comfortable and patient with you mourning. So instead, our society gives you messages to hurry you along. We're actually a mourning avoiding culture, and yet it is a natural process in order to get through the grief process. But we don't like this state because it's extremely painful, and it feels like we're in a state of suspension between what was and what's yet to be. And the bereaved are very tempted to bypass this in order to get to some sort of ending. However, that isn't possible. But in this mourning avoiding culture, we've learned that in order to be well, we have to be happy at all costs. And grief, frankly, is sad and it's painful. And so therefore it must be bad. And if it's bad, then we avoid it. We minimize it. Or we rush to find the end or closure. And that in and of itself is not healthy because we're not following the naturalness of the process. So it's very important that we pay attention, or that you pay attention to what you think about what closure is. There is actually no finish line. We'll talk about that in a little while. The slower you go in the grief process, believe it or not, the faster you'll get to feeling that you can manage it and you're learning to live with it. And don't be fooled into thinking that you have to meet an endpoint or feel some form of closure in order to move forward with your life. Now, normally, if we were gathered in person, we would take a break right now. So we're just going to take a moment and do whatever you need to do to look after yourself. Perhaps you need to get up, move around, or maybe just check in with your body. Put your hand on your heart, be aware of your breathing. Is it rapid? Is it slow? Are you crying? That's okay, that means you're mourning. Take a few deep breaths and just kind of center yourself. Be okay with whatever you're feeling right now. So perhaps the grief process can be referred to man's response to an unfinished story. We never got to finish the story with our loved ones. And we're protesting. And we also have separation anxiety because our loved ones aren't with us. So the question then becomes, how do we finish our story? Or how do we come to terms with it being unfinished? We need to fill in the gaps somehow. We need to complete the story. And while you may not think that's possible, we're here tonight to offer you an alternative. A bereaved mother says, following my 15-year-old son's death, my plans for parenthood sat like scenery on an empty stage. I needed to come up with a new life for myself. And this comes from a book. So I do know that this bereaved mother had done her mourning. She had gone through that painful process of suspension. She would have liked to have bypassed it, but she understood that she couldn't. Dr. Alan Wolfeld says, in many ways, love and grief are very much alike. Just the two sides of the same coin. They both have the power to forever change our lives. Just as I surrender to my love, I must surrender to my grief. However, we're a bit resistant surrendering to our grief because it's so painful. But in our mourning avoiding culture, we are expected to move on quickly. You're expected to say goodbye. You're expected to let them go, get over it, move on, start a new life, or the ultimate, find closure. Is that even possible? Or is that even natural for human beings who have hearts and who have memories? Because closure typically implies, like we talked about at the beginning of this hour, that something is finished or ended or closed forever, put on a back shelf, and finally you can move on. But that's not possible with love. So how do you move on with your life without your loved one physically with you? So I'm proposing a new type of closure. It's called the continuing bond. And it's been defined as the presence of an ongoing inner relationship with your loved one. At one point in time, in Freud's time, it was felt that in order to move on with your life, you had to relinquish all ties with your loved one in order to invest energy in your new life as you move forward. Research has revised that, and that's in fact not recommended, or I think even possible. So we're not talking about relinquishing our relationship with our loved one. What we're talking about after their death, after you have done the process of mourning and your grief symptoms start to soften and they get smaller and easier to carry, we talk about establishing a continuing bond. So we talk about changing the relationship with our loved one to one of physical presence, to one of spirit or memory. Now, in some cases, depending on a person's individual experiences, attachment patterns, in some cases, continuing bonds can be maladaptive. But for the purposes of tonight, we're talking really about an attachment style that was fairly secure with your parents and then with your loved ones, because we know attachment style starts in childhood with our caregivers. So we're going to be talking about a continuing bond in a very healthy manner. And it's actually been recommended that it's actually quite adaptive as the bereaved move forward in their lives. This comes from the Encyclopedia of Death and Dying. Relationships with others, living or dead, frame one's sense of self and how one lives. More and more, we appreciate that there is continuity between the past and the present. Without a sense of the past and an understanding of its place in people's lives, it is difficult to move ahead. So, while our society, our culture is more mourning avoiding, we want to hurry you through the mourning process. We really need to allow ourselves to be in that place of suspension while we review our relationship with our past, with our loved one. Who was this person to us? How did they affect us? What did they bring to the dance of our lives? Now, while that brings a lot of pain, it's also needed to give us a sense of who we are as we move forward. So, what do we mean by a continuing bond? A continuing bond is a very conscious and a dynamic process. It's going to mean different things to different people, or it can manifest itself differently depending on your relationship with your loved one. And it represents, as I said before, a different type of relationship with your loved one. So what you're doing is you're redefining the relationship. Whether you have a spiritual, you have a belief system or not, you can still establish what we call a continuing bond, because love doesn't end. So grief doesn't end, but grief gets manageable, it gets palatable, it gets easier to carry as we do our grief work of mourning. So developing a bond after you've done your mourning is a way for us to remember our loved ones in the story of our life, and then to start creating a new life with them in it, but not physically present. So here are some ideas. Talking to your loved one. Many times I'm asked, am I going crazy? Is that wrong? No, of course not. We had relationships with these people. Visiting the cemetery, is a way of continuing a bond. Memorial services on their death anniversary, or as some people call it, their angel anniversary. Maybe just feeling their presence in a room or in a situation. Maybe you could emulate your loved one in some way. What did they teach you? What did they bring into your life that made you a better person? What about taking up a cause in their memory? What about taking up a cause to improve conditions that may have contributed to their death? A former client of mine whose loved one died on the 401 became very active in a grassroots movement to erect concrete barriers between Windsor and Chatham. That was her continuing bond in a very practical sense that made her feel connected to her loved one. Now, that action in and of itself obviously couldn't bring her loved one back, but she had come to terms with it through her mourning, and she wanted to give her loved one's death some meaning. Imagine what advice they would give you, and then make a decision that's appropriate to you. What about some other ideas? Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. That came out of tragedy as well. That's an example of a continuing bond. A bereaved father says, Michael said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being forgotten. I can see that as part of my mission to continue to allow him to live, to share his story and carry it on. So use their names, talk about it when it's appropriate. As we move forward with our life and we've completed the acute grieving and our mourning, and we're not focused on them, give yourself permission to talk about your loved ones. Maybe you could talk about them with people who didn't know them. Share their stories. They were an important part of your life. Now, you may not be able to do it at the beginning of your grief process without a lot of emotional. That's okay. If you do your mourning, you can get there. Incorporate them into special days. I have another wonderful example of a client of mine whose oldest daughter was getting married after her father died. And instead of the traditional father-daughter dance, which obviously couldn't happen, the family put together a video of special memories of her daughter and her husband. And believe me, there wasn't a dry eye in the room that night. Continue to keep their pictures. Do not take their pictures down. Keep mementos of them around. We call those linking objects. You don't necessarily have to keep everything, because not everything of your loved one is necessary and appropriate for you as you move forward, but keep certain special mementos, but certainly keep your pictures. Finish your project that they were working on. Maybe make their favorite food on their birthday or on their death anniversary. Make donations to a cause in memory of them. That's a way to keep their memory alive. This young 10-year-old boy says, my mother won't talk about my father. She says we need to be strong and just carry on. My father's parents live close, and I go and visit them often. They love to tell me stories about him when he was my age. We talk and we laugh, and we all feel better. I think in a lot of ways this quote from this young child encapsulates our mourning avoiding culture, with mom not talking about his dad, but his grandparents offering him a safe place where they can laugh and cry, and they all feel better. I love that quote. What about planting a garden in their memory, a tree, purchasing a bench? These are all ways that link your loved one as you move forward in your life. They're not your focus, but they're part of. We call that integrating their death into your life as you move forward. Travel to places that they never got the chance to visit, or travel to places that you both enjoyed or that they enjoyed. Continue their Facebook page in memory of them. Maybe you can volunteer in memory of them. Help people that are less fortunate in their memory. It doesn't have to be anything grand. Certainly like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. It can be private. But as long as you feel that you're keeping their memory alive. But somehow you have to figure out how you're going to keep their memory alive. I think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s continued work of his father, or Natalie Cole's emotional rendition of Unforgettable with her father posthumously. It was just a beautiful tribute in both cases to their parents. And the best legacy, the very best legacy that you can offer them is to live your life fully. But you cannot get to that part without doing the painful grief work of mourning. So resist that temptation to try to find the finish line, to find some sort of tidy closure, because that's not possible. Candace, for example, had her sister's favorite peach-colored roses for her wedding. We used peach roses, she said, for her funeral and for my wedding, and it was just a real sense of having her there with us. What a wonderful tribute. It certainly wasn't anything grand, but it was certainly something extremely, extremely meaningful. So in this case, this sibling felt that her sister certainly was there with her on this joyous occasion. Natasha Wagner, the daughter of Natalie Wood, says, I had to learn to have a relationship with someone who wasn't there anymore. And that's what we call a continuing bond. What makes sense to you so that as you move forward in your life, because that is your job, to move forward in your life after you've done your mourning, after your grief softens and changes, how do you take the memory of your loved one forward with you? So death doesn't end a relationship, it changes it. So I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. I hope that you take something away from tonight. Certainly give Families First a call, or myself, if you'd like any more information about the grieving process or what you're going through. And we'll just see whether or not we have any questions. We don't have any questions, so I'm hoping that this was clear. You can certainly watch it again on Families First YouTube channel, and I implore you to be courageous enough to do your grief work so that you can create a continuing bond with your loved one and take them with you as you move forward in your life. Thank you and good night.